On today's video, I'm going to show you guys how to replace the short block on a Stihl KM 131 Kombi unit. This particular unit was having surging issues when it was running. Sometimes when it would be idling, it would start throttling all the way up. Other times when you squeeze the throttle, it would drop in RPMs. So I did a pressure vac test and both of those came back fine. I also did a leak down and the leak down did show some leakage, about 5%. Within 10% is tolerable, but it still does have a leak somewhere. Did a thorough inspection on the unit and there's something internal inside going on. So when I do get this short block off, I'm gonna go ahead and tear it down and find out exactly why it's not working. The reason I'm replacing the short block is my cost is about $130 some versus my labor rate, which is $100 an hour. So it doesn't make sense for me to tear the thing down, find out what it is, buy parts, put it back on there, when I could just replace the short block. It's actually cheaper in the long run. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into the video and I'll show you guys how I get it done. The first thing I'm gonna do is remove the clutch as well as the shaft. This will make it a lot easier to work on when I'm trying to rotate the unit to take parts off and put new stuff back on. There's 3 screws that hold the clutch onto the unit. 2 of them are with the shroud, and then there's gonna be 1 screw that holds the shaft onto the clutch. To remove the handle assembly from the shaft, there's gonna be 2 screws that you need to remove. There's 4 holes. It's gonna be the 2 smaller holes that'll have the screws that you need to take out. The other 2 screws hold the mounting bracket in place, which slides onto the shaft, so there's no need to remove those right now. Now I'm gonna remove the ignition coil. There's 2 screws that hold that ignition coil onto the unit. You also need to remove the spark plug boot as well as the ground wire that goes to the wiring harness. Now I'm going to remove the muffler. There's 2 screws on the top and 1 screw on the bottom that hold the muffler into place. Next, I'm going to remove the 3 screws that hold on the recoil assembly. Next, I'll remove the 2 screws that hold on the cover plate. On the fuel tank, you're just going to have these 2 rubber inserts that hold the fuel tank into place. There's not going to be any screws that are holding it mounted to the unit. The next thing I'm going to do is remove the spacer flange. There's 2 screws that hold this on. It's located between the carburetor and the engine block. One of the screws is actually going to hold on the throttle cable as well as a ground wire. To remove the rest of the electrical assembly, go ahead and pull this orange mount off. To remove the flywheel, go ahead and remove the nut, and then take a punch and hammer right on the center of the crankshaft. That will release the flywheel so you can remove it. Yes, I know that there's flywheel pullers out there, but I've used this method for over a decade and I've never had an issue once with it. All right, here's the new short block. I'm gonna open it up and let's see what's inside. Along with the short block came a little package of goodies here. What it's going to have in here, it's going to have your carburetor gaskets, it's going to have a new impulse line, and it's going to have a new gasket for your muffler as well. And then of course the short block housing, it's going to have everything on there that the other one had, so I don't need to steal any parts off the other one. It's a pretty complete unit. We're just going to go ahead and put the carburetor back on, muffler, plastic components, clutch, flywheel, and go from there. Before I go any farther, I'm going to take the starter cup off the old block and install it on the new block. Next, I'm going to reinstall the flywheel. Make sure that your keyway is lined up before you tighten this down. The next thing I'm going to do is reinstall the clutch onto the flywheel. There's just 2 screws that hold this on, so go ahead and hand tighten them, and then I just crank them a little bit with the impact just to make sure that they stay on. You can also use a torque wrench to make sure you get the proper torque. Now I'm going to install the new impulse line. Now install the spacer flange. Go ahead and tighten the screw on the right, but leave the one on the left open so that way you can reinstall the wiring harness. Now put the plastic insulator in place and then reinstall your ignition coil. I'll get the 2 screws started and then I'll go ahead and gap it with the flywheel before I tighten it down all the way. In order to gap this properly, you're going to have to use a gapping tool with the correct gap, and then you're going to have to rotate the flywheel till the magneto lines up with the ignition coil and it pulls tight. Now I'm going to install the plastic mount that holds the throttle cable and the wiring harness. This is how everything's supposed to look when it's put back into place. Notice I've run the throttle cable into the plastic lever so it's ready to connect the linkage to the carburetor. Now I'm going to reinstall the fuel tank. Go ahead and put those 2 rubber spacers in there and then press the nipples in from the fuel tank into those spots so that way it's secure. Now I'm going to reinstall the carburetor. Make sure you guys connect your 2 fuel lines and don't forget the impulse line that's behind the carburetor, and then also that linkage that's going to go up to your throttle cable from the carburetor. If you forget one of those things, you're going to have to tear the shrouds off to get back to it, so let's do it before we put everything back together. Now I'm going to go ahead and reinstall the clutch drum assembly. Just make sure you're putting the single screw that goes on the bottom in. Do not put the 2 screws on the top because you have to have the shroud in place before you put these screws back in. Don't forget to put the gasket in before you reinstall your muffler. It's a lot easier to put this in before you put the plastic shroud on the bottom because there's a single screw at the bottom that's going to be covered up once that shroud's on. Now we'll go ahead and reinstall the shroud on the bottom. There's 2 screws that hold this into place. Go ahead and tighten the 3 screws down that hold the recoil. I'm going to go ahead and put a new spark plug in place since I'm replacing the short block on this unit. Now reinstall the shroud. You're going to have the 2 screws on the clutch side and then there's 1 on the back side by the recoil. Reinstall the top cover plate. Now install the filter housing. Make sure you guys have put your new gasket in place and then reattach the vent line. There's going to be 2 nuts that hold this assembly in place. Install the filter and the cover and this power head's complete. The last thing to do is reinstall the shaft and the handle.
Overall, not a terribly hard repair. It took me about a half an hour to go through and do everything. Might take you about an hour if you've never done one of these before. So everything's pretty self-explanatory. The parts are usually only going to fit one way. In my next video, I'm going to show you guys how I disassemble the old short block and what I find inside. Might surprise you. It wasn't what I thought it was going to be, but I'll show you in the next video tearing everything down and step by step what the parts look like as I'm pulling them out. So with that, hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you guys did find this video helpful, make sure you guys subscribe to our channel and like the video down below.